picture this. 25-year-old guy named Dave finishes college, lands a decent job, and buys his first home within 3 years. No family money, no side hustle, just a regular paycheck. Fast forward to today. His son, same age, same work ethic, better education. Can't even afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment in the same city his dad bought a house in. Same country, same dream. Completely different reality. So what happened? Was Dave's son just lazy? Did he spend too much on coffee? Or did something much bigger shift underneath everyone's feet? Something no one really warned us about? That's what this video is about. And I promise you, by the end of it, you'll see the numbers clearly. And you'll understand why this isn't a personal failure. It's a systemic one. Here's the thing that confuses most people when this topic comes up. Incomes have actually gone up. On paper, Millennials and Gen Z earn more than their parents did at the same age, even after adjusting for inflation. So shouldn't things be getting better? This is where the difference between income and wealth matters a lot. Income is the money coming in, your salary, your paycheck, what hits your bank account every 2 weeks. Wealth is what's left over after everything else. It's what you own minus what you owe. Savings, investments, property. That's the number that actually tells you how well you're doing financially. And when you look at wealth, not income, the picture gets dark fast. Millennials today hold about 41% less wealth than adults the same age did back in 1989. That's not a small gap. That's nearly half a generation's worth of financial progress gone. Here's another way to look at it. Economists use something called the cost of thriving index, basically a measure of how much it costs to live a decent, stable life. In 1985, a typical male worker needed about 30 weeks of pay to cover the basic annual expenses for a family of 4. By 2018, that same family needed 53 weeks of pay to cover those costs. One problem: there are only 52 weeks in a year. So before we even talk about saving, investing, or building any kind of future, the math is already broken. Let's talk about home ownership, because this is probably the clearest example of how different the game is now. Here's a simple way to measure it. Forget mortgage rates and down payments for a second. Just ask, how many years of your salary does it take to buy the median home outright? Call it the home-to-income ratio. When the average baby boomer was 33 years old, back in 1988, the median home price was $110,000. The median income was about $27,000. That's a ratio of 4. 4 years of work to buy a house. In 2022, when the average millennial hit 33, the median home price was $433,100. Median household income was around $70,000. That's a ratio of 6.1 and rising. To put that in perspective, during the 2006 to 2008 housing bubble, the one that crashed the entire global economy, that ratio was 7. And everyone agreed that was a crisis. We're almost there again. Except this time, nobody declared an emergency. Now let's compare home price growth to inflation. If you bought a home for $100,000 in 1990, that same home costs roughly $377,000 today. But if you just look at general inflation, the cost of groceries, gas, everyday stuff, $100,000 in 1990 is about $231,000 today. So homes didn't just keep up with inflation. They ran past it, lapped it, and are now somewhere on the next track entirely. Why? 2 big reasons. First, population. There are simply way more people competing for homes now. The US population has grown significantly, and more people means more demand, especially in desirable cities. Second, demographics. Baby boomers were more likely to get married young, which meant 2 incomes early on. That gave them more buying power at exactly the right time. Meanwhile, millennials are delaying marriage, staying single longer, and often carrying debt into their 30s before they even start seriously thinking about property. According to the Pew Research Center, only about 55% of millennials live with their own family today. For previous generations, that number was closer to 70 to 85%. The result? Home ownership rates among millennials and Gen Z have been dropping for years. The Home Affordability Index, which measures whether someone on a median income can actually qualify for a median-priced home, recently dropped below 100 for the first time in decades. Below 100 means, if you earn average, you can no longer afford average. Living with parents isn't a punchline anymore. For millions of people under 35, it's just practical math. You need a college degree to compete for jobs. Everyone knows this, so people go get degrees. But a degree costs more than ever. And because more people have one, it's worth less than ever. Let's look at the cost side first. In 1978, minimum wage was $2.65 an hour. In-state tuition at a public college was $688 a year. Those two things were in balance. A student could work summers and part-time and reasonably cover their education costs. Today, minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. But that same in-state tuition, $9,212 a year, that's not a gap, that's a canyon. If tuition had risen at the same rate as wages, it would cost about $1,400 a year today. Instead, it's nearly 7 times that. The average millennial paid around $24,600 a year for college. When baby boomers were in school, adjusted for inflation, that number was around $10,300. More than doubled, in real terms. Total student loan debt in the US has now crossed $1.7 trillion. The average graduate leaves school owing $30,000. That's triple what it was in the 1990s. And about 7% of borrowers owe more than $100,000. Now here's the other side of the equation. The value of the degree itself. The number of students graduating with a 4-year degree has increased by 250% since 1970. That's great for society in general, but in the job market, it means supply has massively outpaced demand. When everyone has a degree stops being a differentiator. So entry-level jobs, the ones that used to say degree preferred, now say degree required, plus 2 to 3 years experience. For an entry-level job, go figure. Average starting salary for a college grad, $50,000 to $60,000 a year, if they're lucky. Many don't even hit that. Meanwhile, they're carrying tens of thousands in debt from the degree that supposedly got them in the door. Why doesn't the cost come down? In most markets, competition brings prices down over time. But higher education is essentially an oligopoly, a market with very few players and massive barriers to entry. Starting a new accredited university isn't like starting a new restaurant. So universities don't face the same pressure to compete on price. They just keep raising it. And people keep paying, because what's the alternative? Not all debt is created equal. That's actually important to understand before we go further. Mortgage debt, for instance, isn't necessarily bad. When you pay a mortgage, you're buying an asset, something that typically grows in value over time. As you pay it down, you build equity. Eventually, you might sell it for more than you paid. That's how a lot of the previous generation built their wealth. But the biggest debt burden for millennials and Gen Z isn't a mortgage. It's credit cards. The average American now carries close to $6,000 in credit card debt. And unlike a mortgage, where your payment is building towards something, credit card debt is pure cost. You borrow $100 for groceries, you pay back $120, then $144. The clock never stops ticking. When wages don't keep up with the cost of living, people start putting everyday expenses on credit, not luxury items, groceries, gas, utilities, things that should be covered by income, but aren't. Cars are another piece of the puzzle that doesn't get talked about enough. The average car payment in the US right now is $716 a month, with a loan term of about 69 months. Interest rates on auto loans are sitting between 8 and 13%. That means a significant chunk of every paycheck is locked up in a depreciating asset, something losing value from the moment you drive it off the lot. Add it all together: student loans, credit card balances, auto loans. Millennials and Gen Z are entering adulthood carrying a financial weight that previous generations simply didn't have, or had in a much smaller form. And the kicker? While all this debt is accumulating, the money that could have been going into savings, investments, or a down payment is being eaten alive by interest. 73% of millennials currently live paycheck to paycheck. So do 66% of Gen Zers. That's not a minority. That's the norm. At this point, someone's probably thinking, okay, but boomers worked hard too. They didn't have iPhones distracting them. They just figured it out. Fair. But let's actually look at the structural advantages they had, because timing and context matter enormously. Malcolm Gladwell made this point about success in his book Outliers. He argued that Bill Gates didn't become Bill Gates just because he was brilliant and worked hard. He was also born at exactly the right moment, with access to rare computing equipment as a teenager, coming of age just as the personal computer revolution was starting. Different birth year, completely different outcome. The same logic applies at a generational level. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, right after World War II, when the US economy was on fire. The US emerged from that war stronger than almost anyone else. Manufacturing was booming. Jobs were plentiful. Wages were rising. The rest of the world was rebuilding, and they wanted American products. That economic tailwind lifted millions of ordinary families into the middle class. On top of that, boomers were a large generation, and in politics, numbers matter. As a huge voting bloc, they pushed for policies that directly benefited them when they were young. Affordable higher education, family support programs, stronger social safety nets. Then, as they aged and their priorities shifted, they voted for different things. Lower taxes on wealth, stronger retirement benefits, fewer funding commitments to the programs that had helped them decades earlier. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how political self-interest works. But the downstream effect is that millennials and Gen Z now live in the policy landscape that boomers shaped for their own benefit in old age, not for the benefit of younger people trying to get started. Third, the education premium has flipped. When only 25% of people had a college degree, having one was genuinely valuable. Now that 40% of adults over 25 have one, the market has moved on. The bar has risen while the payoff has fallen. Boomers didn't just work harder. They worked in a more favorable economy, at a less competitive time, with less debt, and with political tailwinds at their backs. That's not an insult to them. It's just the context. So here's the hopeful take some people offer. Don't worry, baby boomers are going to pass down their wealth. Millennials will be the richest generation in history. And technically, there's some truth to that. Boomers hold close to half of the US's $140 trillion in total wealth. When they pass it down, a lot of money will move. Inheritance doesn't fix inequality. It deepens it. The boomers with the most wealth will pass it to their children, who were already not struggling. The wealthy stay wealthy. The comfortable stay comfortable. But if you grew up without generational wealth, and most people did, there's no inheritance coming that changes your situation. You're still navigating the same broken systems. Expensive housing, expensive education, stagnant wages, and no financial cushion underneath you. The just wait for the inheritance argument is really just a polite way of saying, if your family was already doing well, you'll be fine. Which is exactly the problem. All right, let's be honest about where we are. The system isn't set up in your favor. The rules changed while you were being told to follow the old ones. That's real, and it's worth naming clearly. But knowing that doesn't pay rent. So let's talk about what actually helps. First, housing math. The old rule of thumb is that housing costs, whether rent or a mortgage, should stay at or below 30% of your gross income. This still holds up as a target. If you make $50,000 a year, that's roughly $1,250 a month for rent. In a lot of cities, that's nearly impossible. But if you're going over 30%, every other expense needs to get leaner to compensate. You have less margin, so you need more awareness. Second, cars are quietly destroying a lot of financial lives. A $716 per month car payment at 10% interest is a massive drain. The goal should be to keep your car costs under 10% of your monthly gross income. If that means buying used, buying older, or waiting longer, that's genuinely the right move. And if you can pay off a car in full, right now, with interest rates where they are, that might be the single highest return financial decision you can make. Third, investing, even small amounts, actually matters. If you can free up even $250 a month and put it into a Roth IRA, an individual retirement account where your money grows tax-free, over 40 years at average market returns, you're looking at around $800,000 to $900,000. Push that to $400 a month, and you're past $1.4 million. Max out the contribution, $6,500 per year currently, and you're approaching $2 million. The math is on your side if you start. The biggest enemy isn't the amount, it's waiting. Fourth, job switching is underrated. According to research from the Wall Street Journal, people who change jobs tend to earn significantly more than those who stay put. Sometimes 10, 20, even 30% more. Many people stay in jobs they've outgrown because it feels stable. But loyalty to a company that isn't growing your salary isn't loyalty. It's just leaving money on the table. Fifth, and maybe most important, understand the actual rules of the game you're in. The old script, go to college, work hard, save, retire comfortably, was written for a different economy. That doesn't mean hard work and education are worthless. But it does mean you can't just follow the blueprint and expect the same outcome your parents got. You need to be more intentional, more financially literate, more willing to question advice from people whose economic reality looked nothing like yours. Millennials and Gen Z are not broke because they're weak, lazy, or addicted to overpriced coffee. They're navigating a financial landscape that's genuinely harder than the one their parents faced, with more debt at the starting line, higher costs at every checkpoint, and fewer of the structural advantages that previous generations benefited from. That's not defeatist, that's just accurate. And once you see it accurately, you stop blaming yourself for things that were never your fault, and you start making decisions based on how things actually are, not how you were told they'd be. That's where it starts. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know, do you think younger generations have it harder? Or is this just how every generation feels? Let's actually talk about it.